Hello there. My name is David Brett. I'm the editor of the New Westminster Times, and joining me today is Iain Black, contender for the upcoming Conservative Party of BC leadership race. Thanks, Iain, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me here, David, and good day to all of your many viewers across the country.
Thanks so much. So, before we delve into kind of a Iain Black 101 and, talk about and tackle the issues, why don't you share with people some of the nuts and bolts of the upcoming race for people who are not necessarily crystal clear on how the voting works, when it votes, who can vote, and those details?
Sure, no problem. So, as you mentioned, we're about a little over halfway through the contest, and there's three or four distinct dates that matter. The one that's right in front of us is next Saturday, the 18th of April, which is the deadline for buying a membership in the BC Conservative Party. So these contests are won by voting members of a party. So if you'd like to join the BC Conservative Party and you are a BC resident over the age of 14, you can do so by going to www.bcconservative.ca/black, and you will actually go to the page, or you actually can go to iainblack.ca. That's probably easier. www.iainblack.ca, and there will be a link there to membership, and you can sign up to join the BC Conservative Party and vote in the contest, but only if you do so before next Saturday. The next date that matters after that is May the 9th, which is the date when you start registering to vote. So just being a member isn't enough. You've got to register to vote. There will be some sort of an identity confirmation process that the party has yet to share with us, but I believe it'll involve kind of proof of your driver's license or something to make sure that the person requesting a ballot is actually the person who signed up to be the member. So it's a bit of an integrity gatepost. And then the voting itself will take place in the last couple of days of May. Again, those dates are yet to be specified by the party. And it's all done on May 30th, when there will be a meeting and the leader will be revealed.
Wow, that's coming up pretty fast. So by the
And the
time
other key
June rolls
dates,
around, we'll
yep,
have a new leader. Um, so that's great information for people to understand. So they got to register to as a party member and then
yep,
register to vote. And
that's right.
then when it comes to the way in which the leaders is decided, it's a ranked ballot, right? You have
Yes, good point.
the for people who have never voted in a
Yep,
nomination contest before, you can choose, your one, two, three, four, five,
yes, you rank them.
in order of it's not just one or none.
That's right. So let me walk you through that, because thank you. I should have mentioned that as well. So as you say, David, it's a ranked ballot. So you don't just mark an X next to your preferred choice. You actually rank them. As you say, my guess is there'll be four or five people on the final ballot. We don't know yet. There are currently six people still in the contest. There were 11. And you rank your preference. And the way it works is that you're pursuing 50% plus one of available points. So there's 93 ridings in the province of British Columbia. Each one is given 100 points. So a
Hmm.
riding with 3,000 members in it will be given the same weighting as a riding with maybe just a couple hundred members in it, which makes it for interesting strategy when you're a guy like me.
Right.
And so each riding is calculated by percentage in terms of where the votes went, and the corresponding number of points. So if I get a third of the votes in any riding, regardless of its size, I'll get 33 points towards a total. So we are all pursuing 50% plus one of the total number of points. So that would be 4,651 points. On the
Mhm.
very first ballot, if one of the candidates, let's assume there's five, if one of the candidates has 4,651 points, it's all over. But if they don't, then what happens is the person at the very bottom gets removed from the ballot. And all of that person's number two votes get distributed with everybody else, and then they count them up again. And if nobody has 4,651 points, then the next person is dropped off the bottom. And that person's number two votes are then redistributed to the other remaining candidates, and so on until you're down, so, until somebody reaches that 4,651 points.
Wow. Well, thanks for that explanation. I think sometimes in this country, in this province, we take for granted the ability we have to participate in
Mm,
democracy. And a nomination contest is a really important democratic process to select a leader of a party that could form the next government. So to segue, Iain Black, you are running really to be the leader not only of the Conservative Party, the official opposition right now, but also to, uh, hopefully form government. So you're a veteran of BC politics. Why don't you give folks a bit of a Iain Black 101, your background and your experience in politics, and not only that, your background in the business world?
Sure. Well, let me start where you started, which is this is a unique opportunity because you've got a government that's been in place for 9 years. It is not doing well. The economy's not doing well. Healthcare is not doing well. Education's not doing well. They have lit a veritable dumpster fire on the indigenous file with their piece of legislation called DRIPA that have people astonishingly enough worried about whether they actually have private property rights in the home that they own at the moment. So this is a government in trouble and clearly out of ideas and out of time. So whoever wins this BC Conservative Party leadership has a pretty good shot of being the next Premier of British Columbia. And the number one job of that individual will be to really unite our party and defeat the NDP. That is the number one criteria of anybody in this contest is can you unite our team and beat the NDP in the next general election? So all of us are putting our best foot forward. And my story, to your point, looks something like this. I have a career of running technology companies and one or two non-technology companies, but I'm a tech guy. I've been running companies for most of the last 25 odd years, 35-ish years overall in my career. And two terms, I was an elected MLA and cabinet minister. Back in 2005, I ran for office at the invitation of a friend in the political family, and I won the nomination and I won the election. I became Gordon Campbell's youngest MLA in the second of his 3 terms as premier. And then I ran again in 2009. I was reelected. And in that process, Gordon Campbell put me on the Treasury board. So I learned the mechanics of how to build what is now a $90 billion a year budget and all the difficult decisions that are involved. And quite literally, you're choosing between, building a hospital in Fort St. John versus a bridge in Kamloops or building a school in Abbotsford. Like those are literally the decisions you need to make. And they're very big decisions and, a lot of zeros involved. But the experience of that is very, very important. And then he promoted me, and I became Gordon Campbell's youngest cabinet minister in his government. I had 3 different portfolios, almost all of them focused on, or the focus was almost predominantly the economy. So I was economic development, small business, technology, and also the labor minister. So with that experience, I entered into this competition. After that time in government, I went back into the private sector and it was involved in 2 more CEO gigs. But I would pause just for a second and identify that my expertise in business is taking over troubled and dysfunctional companies. I literally, I'm the guy they call when things are going wrong. The strategy's wrong, the product's wrong, the people are wrong, and they're almost always hemorrhaging money, which kind of sounds a lot like BC at the moment. So that's my experience. So most of my career is in business. I have twice had the privilege of serving the people as an MLA and cabinet minister, but it's that combination of experiences that has me compelled to put my name forward again. I actually didn't think I was going back into politics. I loved the experience, but I thought my time in politics was done. But the crossroads we are at as a province is sufficiently concerning to me that I am putting my name forward and believe that with my experience that I've got and my skills that I have, especially in the organizational dynamics and getting people on the same page and getting them to defeat somebody like the NDP, I'm the best position to actually defeat the NDP because I've already done it twice to form government.
Okay. Well, you outlined kind of a boatload of problems that province is facing. Well, why don't we start off with, I think, the crisis that is on the top of everyone's mind, and that relates to the Indigenous file,
Yeah.
because it connects into all of the economic problems and issues that we face, and that is the ownership of the land. We've had the Cowichan decision.
Mhm.
throwing a wrench into private property rights. We have DRIPA, the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People Act.
Yeah.
Then there's an Amendment Act. And this has caused this big question mark to sort of float around on top of the province for outside investors to look at and think, really, should money pour in here to into the resource economy, mining, oil and gas, pipelines, ports? It's hard to name an industry, even real estate. Why would someone buy and develop land if they're, for example, the Musqueam decision? Now, why would someone come in and buy land now while that kind of uncertainty floats around? What are your thoughts on that issue and how best to tackle that and kind of remove some of that uncertainty and um, difficult question?
Well, I would start by sharing with your viewers the heart-wrenching conversations I've been having throughout the province as I've been touring it over the last couple of months. I've been far and wide. We're going back on the road after next week, and I can't wait. But some of these conversations where the anxiety in people's voices is really real. I mean, there's anger, there's confusion, but people are worried, people are scared, and I find the fact that we're even having this conversation quite a head shaker. Like I've got people all over British Columbia right now asking me questions about who owns BC. Is it the 6 million people that live here, or is it the 300,000 First Nations? And like they want to understand what is their path forward. And the sad and I would argue unacceptable irony is that the cavalier way with which, and reckless way with which the NDP has handled the Indigenous file over the last decade has probably put back legitimate reconciliation about 15 years. And it blows my mind the fact that we're having a conversation asking about whether we actually own our own homes, whether the private property rights that are the fundamental underpinning of every Western democracy. If you don't have private property rights, you don't have an economy. Like this is like when people talk about foundational issues, this is one of them. So you identify the issue. I'm sharing that it's very real and it's very personal. Yeah, there are business investments locally that people are delaying, and you've also got are being delayed. You've also got international investments in the major resource sectors that you identified, where they're standing back and going, "Yeah, no, we're not doing this at all until you guys have got this all sorted out." This is impacting jobs, it's impacting investment, and all these chickens are coming home to roost on the arrogant and secret way that the NDP have dealt on this file. So what do we have to do? Like as you say, it's the most burning issue. The first thing we have to do is we have to repeal two pieces of legislation. One of them, as you mentioned, is called DRIPA, and the other one is an addition that was made, an amendment that was made to a piece of legislation called the Interpretations Act of BC. It's basically the glossary of terms that give you context and definition for every other piece of legislation in government. Think like the glossary in the back of a book. If you don't understand a term, you kind of see it, you flip to the back, and you see what the definition is, and then you keep reading. That's what the Interpretations Act is for BC. The changes made by the NDP government to the Interpretations Act take DRIPA, which is already very, very problematic on its own, and they bind the rest of government to conforming to it across every other piece of legislation. So this is not just a one and done. This piece of legislation called DRIPA is enormously impactful throughout the rest of government. So both of those need to be repealed right away. The second thing, or third thing, I guess, that needs to be done is we need to open up a conversation around Section 35 of our Constitution. Now, again, we're all becoming experts at the Constitution these days because of this crazy situation that we're in BC. But Section 35 of our Constitution deals with Aboriginal rights and title. And we need to add a little phrase in there that says, excluding private property rights, and take this issue off the table permanently so that we're not having this conversation anymore. Interestingly, we are one of the few Western democracies, Canada that is, who doesn't actually enshrine private property rights in the Constitution. We don't. So every other one does, by the way. So because it doesn't, we need to kind of go at it through Section 35, where we're dealing with the Aboriginal rights and titles, and actually specify that this does not cover that, and private property rights are just fine. Thank you very much. So that conversation needs to be started with the other premiers in the province, which I will do after winning the election and before actually even being sworn in as premier. I will start those conversations to make sure the other premiers are alive to the intent of British Columbia to bring that conversation up and get it dealt with.
Okay. Yeah, well, a related question to that, is somewhat of a cultural question. And sometimes people say, well, there's social issues and economic issues. And it seems to me that they're starting to bleed together. Social issues do have an economic impact. And that's the concept of the culture of British Columbia, the history of British Columbia, and the history of Canada, and the painting of our society as a genocidal society that sought to exterminate indigenous people. And this is a narrative which is sort of taken hold, and it is somewhat underpinned by the news that came out of Kamloops in 2021, the idea of mass graves, and that there's an archipelago of mass graves um, across the country, and everywhere you look, there seems to be different camps. There's the folks that say, oh, well, you can't question that information, and you know, archaeological work such as excavations seem to be postponed indefinitely. So a lot of British Columbians, at least as far as I can tell, are just kind of sick and tired of being told that their culture is bankrupt and that they should own up to genocide. What are your thoughts on that and the way to kind of deal with people's frustrations with that dialogue being in the background of all of this?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there to unpack. So let me try my best. There's like 4 or 5 different topics of conversation within that, but we can jump around as you want. I think the way you frame the question is important. A lot of context there. I could add 3 or 4 more pieces from all of my travels I've done and the conversations I've had with British Columbians in the last 90 days on this topic. I think all of them, and I will come back to some of the specifics of what you touched on. I think all of them, however, point to the very real risk involved in selecting a leader of the BC Conservative Party who will become the next premier, who does not have a command on how to deal with what's after the repealing of DRIPA. All of us want to repeal DRIPA, and there's not one of us who doesn't. And the challenge that we've got as party members and ultimately the population of this great province is okay, that's fine, but who's got the experience and skill in the leadership capability to deal with what happens the day after? Because the challenges are going to be very real for a lot of the reasons you just described. We've got a cultural crossroads that we're at. And I say small c, cultural crossroads. I mean, I don't like, I'm almost cautious with labels. I was never a fan of cancel culture and all that stuff, and I thought it was highly destructive and divisive. And I'm a big believer in, as you say, being able to question things. I mean, it's a fundamental underpinning of our democracy, right? So I think that question you just posed ties together with the previous one around DRIPA. So how do we have these conversations? Well, I have, in all of my conversations, I have had a lot of focus and a lot of feedback from people who are anxious about the private property issues. There isn't anybody I've spoken to who doesn't think that the indigenous people of this province don't want for their children the same thing that the rest of us want, which is an opportunity to go forward and do well for themselves and set up their opportunity for their kids and grandkids. So we're all kind of on the same page there, I think. And where the conversation has been divisive is where we start identifying different classes. And I look at our school system right now and some of the challenges we have in our school system. And it actually is kind of a melting pot of a lot of the issues you just identified. Because we've got a lot of schools today, a lot of them, who don't start the day with "Oh Canada" anymore. And when I found that out, I was astonished. I mean, as a kid, that it's part of our national identity to be proud of living in this country for all of its challenges and all of the stuff that we've done wrong or right, for all of our achievements and all of our failures as a country. We are still, in my view, the best country in the world in which to live. That's why my parents immigrated here. That's why most people immigrate here. And that doesn't mean we turn our backs on mistakes that we made. No, we learn from them. Hopefully, we made them in good faith, but let's go forward in good faith and in recognizing failures and mistakes and whatnot. So, when you've got a school system that does not start the school day with "O Canada," but does start the school day with a land acknowledgement that refers to us as being settlers and colonizers and living on stolen land, I'm not okay with that. I don't think that's helpful. I think it's divisive. And I think that it's not part of the Canadian identity. And that is where you've got identity politics creeping into our school system. And I think that has to end because I don't think it helps the relationship with our First Nations citizens as we go forward to carve out a path together and turn the page on the difficult history we've got in good faith through true reconciliation. And I mean, reconciliation comes to an end, right? When people reconcile, it comes to an end. People nod at each other and they are willing to go forward together in good faith. And that's where I think we need to get to in this conversation. And a lot of the cultural stuff you've identified is not helpful for getting us there.
Hmm. Okay, well, another cultural, with a small c, realm that does have impact on the economy concerns, call them regulatory colleges or regulatory, sort of quasi-governmental regulatory bodies, such as the BC College of Nurses, who a colleague of ours at the Westminster Times, Amy Hammond Nurse, was subjected to a massive legal assault to which ultimately led to her losing her livelihood, young mother, and nothing to do with nursing. So we have this crisis in healthcare of recruiting people and a shortage of doctors and nurses and other workers
Mm-hmm.
in healthcare. But we are also putting up these barriers for people who may not believe the certain dogmas that are being put forward by these regulatory bodies. Is it time to shake up these regulatory bodies in BC?
You were taking me somewhere else in this question, but I ended up with the same answer. Um, there's a piece of legislation called the Healthcare Occupations HPOA, Healthcare Professions Occupations Act, which just came into force on April 1st, which should really concern many, many of your viewers. It was also known as Bill 36. And what that does, it's one of the most invasive overreaches I've seen of a government in my lifetime, where the provincial government is now taken. I can't remember how many there are. There's like a lot, like more than a dozen. There might be as many as 30. Basically, health related professions. There's the massage therapist. There's the dental hygienist. There's nurses and doctors. There's traditional Chinese medicine. I mean, there's many of them. And basically, the government has now taken it upon themselves to replace all of their boards of directors with government appointees. And part of that same legislation puts a gag order in place on the individuals working in those professions such that they can't actually criticize the body of which they are now a member, their professional body, at risk of a fine or being suspended. And some of the fines are substantial, like hundreds of thousands of dollars, or being suspended from practicing in their preferred area of work, right? And that to me is a dramatic overreach, and it will be repealed once I become premier of this province because I actually, you've got safeguards in place, and if they're inadequate, then they should be strengthened. Fine. To look for malpractice, people who are clearly just bad actors in their profession, that's going to happen once in a while. We got to catch them and get them out of it. And you hear that in the news once in a while, and people are being caught, people are being disciplined, and they're being exited out of the profession if they're clear that they cannot meet the expected high standard of professionalism code of conduct. But this is a dramatic overreach that has got many, many people in the healthcare industry very, very upset. Industry is, by that I mean the various professions. Like I'm thinking of the dental hygienists and the massage therapists. When I say industries, because they are private practices for the most part outside of our public healthcare system. So That I actually think the timeliness of your question is bang on. And I think we've got literally the last 4 or 5 days the implementation of a piece of legislation that must be reversed because it's not government's business to do this. I think it's draconian. I think it stifles free speech. And the very situation you were describing could happen far more easily without any reasonable chance of a fair hearing or discussion because the individual involved could be fined very heavily and tossed right out of their line of work.
Yeah, and we're not talking about malpractice, people, nurses administering the wrong medication. I mean, during the Amy Ham trial, I looked up a lot of uh, the rulings from the nurses' college, and there's some serious bad stuff that happens. You know, people stealing drugs.
Mm,
You know, they're mistreating their patients.
yeah,
We're
very serious
talking
stuff.
about uh, social media posts.
Hmm.
Should Doesn't
Yeah.
this kind
This
of
kind
create
of
this
create this
chill?
no. Yeah, no, I was trying to remember. Thank you for reminding me. That was part of that case. I was kind of going through my head about the elements that made it so ring for me, and that was probably it. I am a staunch believer in free speech. I do not like we have a very high bar in this country around hate speech. And I've been very public to the point of severe criticism for talking about examples of hate speech, particularly within our Jewish community, where it's very clear. You have CISAs involved, you've got organized efforts, and it is full on hatred and it's violent, and you can point to it. It's orchestrated, um, and it absolutely qualifies and meets, unfortunately, that very high bar of hatred. But it's a high bar for a reason because I'm a big proponent of free speech. I would rather know where you stand on something, David, and actively and vehemently disagree, but defend to the death your right to say what you're saying. And I really struggle. And you look at examples in the UK, and that's where the Amy Ham situation is headed. You look what's happening in the UK right now, where the police are showing up at people's homes and quite literally arresting them for social media posts that they put online, and they do not in any way, shape, or form meet the very high bar of hate speech that we have in Canada. Oh, and by the way, they have that similar law in the UK. Like they've lowered that to the point where they're stifling free speech. I would rather be shaking my head going, I don't agree with that guy at all. I think that person is a bit nuts, or they clearly don't get it, or they're just wrong. And I would rather have that scenario any day of the week than have people stifled from feeling they can actually do that in a country like Canada. And I'll add one footnote to it as well, if I may. Even along that really dark and unacceptable path to hate speech, before you actually reach that bar of something being illegal, I actually want to know what you're thinking. Because if you are heading on that path of something that is truly hateful towards a person because of who they are, their ethnicity, their religion, their sexual orientation, their gender, I don't, I want to know where you are. I want that bright light of freedom to serve a purpose of also identifying people who are saying some things that we actually are very concerned about. I want to know where they are. I don't want them driven underground. I want these people in plain light. So if and when they cross that line, we have no excuses for not arresting them, for not actually cracking down on truly criminal behavior when it happens.
Yeah, good point. Well, let's talk about just anti-Semitism just for a minute, because
Sure.
the BC NDP under David Eby ran clean out of office Selena Robinson, a prominent cabinet minister
Minister of
a few
Finance. Yeah.
years ago.
Mhm.
I would say essentially because she was saying a Jewish person saying Jewish things. And that attracted this horrible protest at her office, and people were calling for her. You know, the outpouring of hate directed at her was horrendous. And then Evie just so there's this kind of saying that, well, we're for anti-racism and we're for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and this idea of inclusion being part of the uh, NDP's fight against the conservative. Um, let's be honest, they're constantly painting conservatives as racists and
Yeah.
uh, bigoted people. But how? But anyway, I thought I'd bring that up
Yeah.
because aren't we, isn't it kind of hypocritical of the NDP to, you know, be virtue signaling
Yeah.
all the time?
Well, you know, I'm going to grab that thread and run with it. There's two questions in. Let me take a poke at one of them. So I'm a lifelong conservative since a little boy, right? And I didn't come from a particularly politically active family. My mom and dad were school teachers who immigrated to Canada. I mean, the reason you and I are chatting here is because in 1964 they went on a 2-year adventure. They've been married 9 days, and they came to Canada for a 2-year adventure as school teachers. And they had all their worldly possessions in a suitcase. I do not come from a a wealthy family at all, and they had a 2-year teaching contract. And 37 years later, Dad retired from that same school, and I
Mm,
followed in their pattern, moving to BC. And 33 years later, I'm still here. I was only supposed to be here a couple of years, but my point is that Mom and Dad were an unusual. They were conservative public school teachers, but we weren't a politically active family.
mm,
So I bring that up because as conservatives, if we have one failure as conservatives in the last, I'm going to say 15 years, maybe 20, but certainly 15, is we broke one of the number one rules of politics, which is we did not define ourselves. I was told early on when I was first elected, back as a fairly young fellow, when I was first elected as an MLA, somebody said to me, a veteran of the business, turned to me and said, Ian, if you don't define yourself, your political opponents will define you. So define yourself. And I think we stopped doing that as a conservative movement or as a conservative party, whatever word you want to use, about 15 odd years ago. And our political opponents on the left actually were very good at defining themselves and carving out the territory for what they stood for. And what's worse is they started defining us. And every negative human attribute was dropped onto a left right political spectrum: racism, misogyny, sexism, meanness. Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in the same breath were, both on the right wing, if you will, side of the political spectrum, and that drove me crazy. It's like, why is it that every negative element of humanity is being dropped on my side of the political spectrum? I don't like this one bit, and it's our own fault because we didn't define ourselves. So I often point out to people, let me remind you
mm.
that it was a Democrat in America, left wing, who started the KKK. And it was a Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, who freed the slaves and ended slavery in America. And I go further. I said, show me a picture from a union hall. This is not a shot at the union movement, but show me a picture from the union halls in the 1960s or 70s where there's a woman on the executive, never mind a black person in America. They were there. Right. So I agree with you. It's a wee bit of a tangent, but you set me up for it. I thought I'd pull on the string because it is crazy to me that we've allowed ourselves to be defined that way. Because most of the folks that I know, I find if you want to find hatred and racism and misogyny and meanness and unkindness, you'll find it all over the political spectrum if you're honest enough to open your eyes and find it. Now, having said that, coming back to Selena Robinson, I know Selena. When I was an MLA, we come from the same part of town. We're both from the Tri Cities. For the benefit of your viewers, the Tri Cities is 45 minutes outside of the downtown of Vancouver, and we live in different parts of the town. But she was elected as an MLA with the NDP, and in the second of my terms, and I was still with the Campbell government at the time. And so we actually served together briefly. And then when I left government to go as CEO of the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade, the government changed in 2017 and she became a minister. I know Selena. I know her character. We don't see the world politically the same way. And we actually have a lot of fun debating it. She's a decent human being. She's raised a great family. And I got a lot of time for her. And I think the way she was treated was abysmal. It was unkind. It was categorically unkind. They threw her under the bus. And rather than confront some of the blatant challenges that were plainly there to see within the NDP, they used her as a sacrificial lamb. And so, yeah, that was rather shocking to me. And it's only got worse since then. And she's become somewhat of an advocate for constantly shining a light on little corners of our society in BC and across Canada where behaviors need to be called out, where decisions need to be called out. And she would be the first one to say that this is not okay for any faith to be treated the way that a lot of Jewish people are being treated right now. And there has been a marked change. All the police data says it. I mean, this is not just an opinion here. It's backed by police files. The fact that CSIS is involved, come on. Yeah, I'm very empathetic for what Selena Robinson had to go to, even though we will agree with each other that we are tragically politically misaligned.
Right. Well, how's this for a segue?
Sure.
So we're currently in a world where oil is suddenly trading at $110 a barrel.
Yeah, no kidding.
Was half that a couple weeks ago. And Canadians may be asking themselves, wouldn't it be nice if we had proceeded with the Enbridge Northern Gateway Pipeline project? Wouldn't it be nice if we had Keystone XL going ahead? And I say that it's kind of related to what we're saying about culture is this sort of self-image we as Canadians have as um, maybe not less than. Shouldn't, so now we're in a position, we've got LNG that's sort of on deck. But to the earlier point, EB is kind of making this calculus and making this case to the public all the time. Well, if we don't have DRIPA and we don't have these agreements with First Nations, well, all of these projects, including LNG, are just going to disappear and be thrown into court. And it's this kind of gamesmanship, wouldn't you say, where we've got a lot of catching up to do when it comes to fossil fuels. But now mining is also kind of in the crosshairs. I know EB's talking about critical minerals.
Mhm.
I'm in the mining industry and I covered the mining industry both in Toronto and here quite a bit. But there's this kind of, well, if you don't pay off the First Nation or create some kind of a deal, a price tag, everything's off the table. So how did we get here where Canada can't A, help the rest of the world with oil supply or um, help the economic impact of these high prices? How can BC play a leadership role in fixing this resource morass we've gotten ourselves into?
I think it's one of my biggest frustrations when I look at things economically. I mean, but it also it's a frustration when I look at it economically, and it's a great concern when you bring that down to what it means for families in our northern communities and our interior communities where natural resources are the way of life, and the anxiety that people are feeling about after a lifetime in, pick your industry, forestry, mining, gas, oil. He or she don't have that job anymore, and they're worried that their children won't have a career in their industry where they've committed their careers to. So it's both those things for me. I'm the guy when I was CEO of the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade who chartered an airplane from Vancouver to Edmonton, and I filled 200 people with industry leaders, indigenous leaders, labor leaders, community leaders, and we flew to Edmonton. It was a top story in the news. Actually, it was pretty fun. We flew to Edmonton to meet with an NDP premier of the day to let her know that British Columbia hadn't lost its mind, and 65% of us, as is the stat by the way, are firmly in favor of using pipelines to get our natural resources to Tidewater so that we stop selling them to the Americans at a 30% discount. And that was before the current context of geopolitics and Iran, never mind Russia, that you mentioned at the beginning of this segment. So I am very, very strongly in favor of getting our natural resources to Tidewater using pipelines for sure. But second part of your question is addressed this way. We've got a government that has systematically placed itself in opposition repeatedly around pipelines. They sort of, throw a bone at the natural gas end of things, but that's kicking and screaming. And this suddenly newfound love affair with mining industry is driven by one thing and one thing only. And it does not, by the way, forgive them of their sins, which I'll come to in a minute. But their newfound love affair with a couple of mining projects is because there are 22,000 jobs, family supporting jobs that are tied up in 4 projects. And those 4 projects are all coming to an end. And finally, someone in Victoria, after the horses have left the barn, are looking around going, what are these people going to do? And those 4 projects, Site C, the TMX expansion, LNG Canada, the Coastal GasLink project, all of which I will point out were done with deals on the table with our First Nations community. Did they take longer than they should have to get the deal done? Yes, they did. Were they probably more expensive because of that? Yes, certainly in terms of the carrying cost of the money involved in building those big projects. Yes, they were more expensive. But the deals got done, and the proponents figured they could still do it profitably, and 22,000 British Columbian families benefited as a result. Those jobs are coming to an end. So now you've got this sudden love affair with mining that I can't help but think is fleeting, because the NDP, with their approach to our Indigenous community and this land back ideology that's clearly driving them, is been the biggest barrier we've seen. Forestry is your best example, the coastal forestry industry. When I was meeting with forestry workers in Campbell River, which I was about a month ago, they were sitting across from me, wringing their hands, going, "We've been doing this for decades. And the normal time to get a cut lot permit is about 4 to 6 months. But because of the NDP and DRIPA, and I might add, the revolving door of regulations that they keep changing every 6 months. So these companies are having to hire more people just to keep up on the regulation of the day. It now takes between 24 and 36 months to get the same permit that 5 years ago they could get between 4 and 6 months. These are not my stories. These are the stories of the British Columbians I've been talking to in the forestry industry, and in the mining industry, it's even worse. They measure stuff in years. So it's all been made worse by the NDP, mainly through DRIPA and through the philosophy and ideology they have about the rest of us being colonizers and settlers. And it's, as I said at the beginning of the interview, you've now reached a point where the common question I get from mill workers, from mining engineers and forestry folks is, who owns British Columbia? Like, is it the 6
Yeah.
million people who live here, or is it the 300,000 First Nations? Because we've reached this crazy impasse where those kinds of questions, which would have been just unheard of a year ago, are now very much at everybody's kitchen table. And they're coming to guys like me as I go about this contest.
Yeah. Well, uh, maybe we could kind of up around this question. The problems you outline and we're discussing here, there's cultural issues, but they all kind of intersect around the resource industry, but also things like real estate. Uh, the all the rules that have been brought down for what you can't do, what is going to cost you more to invest, and all the things that supposedly are going to help affordability. Aren't all these things adding up to the point where there really should be an election provincially sooner rather than later? What do you think are going to be the triggers to bring about an election in BC? Uh, I don't want you to get your crystal ball out or think they put you on the spot, but I don't know. Does it seem like the level of frustration amongst voters is so high that they just want to make a change now, not
Yeah.
2 years from now?
So let me remind you of my context. I've been president CEO of 6 different companies, including president and CEO of the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade, the largest business organization, most of whom are small business, by the way,
Mhm.
between here and Toronto, right? I have raised money in capital markets. I've been CEO of 3 companies that were publicly created, one of which was on the large board in Toronto, and we merged that with a NASDAQ-based company. My point is, I understand my way around a lot of the business decisions that get made in the private sector. And don't forget, I was on that provincial treasury board, managing what is now a $90 billion a year budget. So here's what I know for sure. It has never been like this before. Never.
Mhm.
You're not wrong in your characterizations. Whether you're in the real estate business in Vancouver or the real estate development business in Kelowna or Fort St. John, everybody is shaking their head and going, why am I doing this? Ronald Reagan made the joke a long time ago. He says, I was the 10 words that, is it 10 or 8? I have to count them. The 10 words that put fear into the heart of every business person was, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. It was a bit of a joke, right? And he meant well-intentioned bureaucrats. The difficulty we have is much worse than that. I do believe that the provincial government has become the Department of No. The provincial government has become business prevention unit. And a lot of it is ideological because they don't understand what creates jobs. And they think that wealth creation and your family getting ahead is a bad thing and that you should be punished if you reach a level of success more than the person sitting right next to you, even though you might be working harder than they are. So when you've got that as your fundamental belief, you can't help but to run into problems. So let me touch on what I would do about it, because I think that's an important, like you and I could sit all day and we're in violent agreement on the challenges, but let's talk about what I would do about it. All right. So when I become premier of this province, the first bill you put on the table has to be repealing DRIPA and Section 8.1 of the Interpretations Act. It has to be, because our province has become uninvestable. Right. One of the second or third bills will be an instruction for the small business minister of, well, I would probably name the ministry the Minister of Small Business and Deregulation. They'd be given the instruction, the mandate, but also the expectation for which to which I will hold them accountable of eliminating the regulatory burden in this province that has been created by the NDP. So I would give them 2 years maximum to get our regulatory burden down to 10% below that which it was in 2017. That will impact all of our natural resources sector. And it'll stay true to one of the conservative principles that I hold very dear, which is government's job is to pave the way and then get out of the way. Right. And what that in particular in the real estate sector, you've got multiple layers of building codes that are differing by municipality, and then a provincial building code that goes on top of that, which serves no purpose at all, other than to frustrate the process and drag out the duration it takes to get a building permit to build anything. You've now got a situation, David, where if you want a building permit in not just Vancouver, but a lot of smaller cities as well, to build a small little apartment building when we're in the middle of a housing crisis, to build small one, 50, 100 units, that's not that big. There's some in Vancouver, of course, that are in the thousands, but it can take 5 years. 5 years. That's the same period of time during twice in our history when we've entered into and won a world war. And we can't build a little apartment building. So those things have to change. And it's going to be the regulation. It's going to be getting rid of DRIPA. It'll also be mandating municipalities to get stuff done within a certain period of time and borrow some of what's being done elsewhere. A presumptive law that says if you don't respond to a permit request within a certain period of time, 90 days, 6 months, 2 years, whatever it might be relative to be appropriate for the permit being applied for, then the presumptive answer will be approved. Keep moving, right? And will there be issues there we have to contend with? Of course there will. But if we don't set that bar and take the full power of government to enforce it, nothing will change. But I am committed to that change. I know how to do it. I've got the skills and experience to do it. And frankly, I think it's a big risk for the members of this party and the people of British Columbia if we put a leader in place that doesn't have the skills and experience to actually get British Columbia back on track.
Okay. One last question. I think
Yes,
then
sir.
this is a good one to end on. The province has been in this public health emergency around the overdose crisis for a long time. We have homelessness, we have crime and disorder on the streets. We've got a barrage of policies coming out of Victoria like decriminalization, safe supply, harm reduction that evidently aren't working, but there seems to be no willingness to change course, fundamentally for ideological reasons. What are your thoughts on how to kind of break this kind of trend, this seemed intractable problem, the downtown east side, and that's spreading to other municipalities where, again, you have some of the more sort of woke ideologues saying, well, it's the conservatives and they're kind of anti-poor, bigoted, thoughts and NIMBYism. What's going to fix this issue and help BC get on track towards improving the the approach to the overdose crisis and all the related mental illness
Yeah.
issues as well.
Yeah, it is related. And again, I go back to what it means to be a conservative. I'll tell you what conservatives do not believe in. We don't believe it's okay to step over your fellow citizens in the sidewalk. And we've been conditioned that that's okay. That, I mean, when you and I were little kids, David, you know, we're both of the right age to remember Eaton's. And we'd be walking into Eaton's on a Saturday morning when we were little boys holding our mom's hand. And if there's somebody lying on the sidewalk, which there occasionally was, normally it was alcohol, right? It wasn't some of the terrible poisons that are being peddled on our streets these days. Our moms would stop and they'd look down and go, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Right? This was before cell phones. It's not like they could phone an ambulance whipping out a cell phone at the time, right? But we cared. There was an element of ownership for a fellow human that we've lost that little piece of humanity. Shame on us for being there, over there. And as conservatives, we don't believe that that's okay. So you are right. You talked about everything's related. I actually do believe that it's related. I'll answer your question this way, very broadly, but then very specifically. Central theme of our campaign. I mean, our slogan is Get BC Back on Track. But a central theme of our campaign has been restoring your Main Street. And the most important word in that, David, is the word your. Because I'm not just talking about that 6 blocks, the travesty of humanity that is East Hastings Street here in Vancouver. Every city, small and large, in British Columbia now has their own East Hastings. Go for a beer in the summer in Penticton and sit in one of those beautiful outdoor little pubs. And you can't enjoy your beer and hopefully decent chicken wings without somebody passing by and engaging you who's clearly homeless and almost always clearly drug addicted in some fashion, under the influence at that given moment for sure. And that's a personal memory because it happened to me in Penticton every time I've been there now the last 2, 3 summers. And it's Penticton, it's Fort St. John, it's Poughkeepsie, it's Kitimat, Terrace, Cranbrook. Pick your city. Every mayor and councillor is concerned about it to the point that that's what they talk to me about when I've been visiting all these great communities. This is the first thing they say. I expect to hear about forestry and mining and oil and gas challenges in Fort St. John, and the meeting opens talking about mental health and drug addiction every time. So this is real. So if there is a brilliant silver lining around such a dark and worrying topic, it's the fact that people are ready for change. They want things to be done differently. They realize whatever it is we're doing is not working. And you said evidently things like safe supply aren't working. The evidently is the right word because the evidence is very, very clear. The data is very, very clear. It's not. And I don't want to think how many hundreds, if not thousands, of our citizens we've lost unnecessarily to overdose in the last 4 or 5 years under the reckless approach of the NDP. It's not okay in my view, not okay one little bit. So here's what I'm going to do about it. I actually believe that if you solve mental health and drug addiction or make meaningful steps in that, you actually also solve public health, public safety, small business viability. Remember that restore your Main Street? This is where it comes down to. Let's get the main streets of our province, places where families want to go on a Saturday to do their shopping again, where they're not afraid to park their car, walk across the street. They don't have to step over people getting into the butcher's or the local hardware store, or wherever it is they're going. But to do that, we have to start, in my view, and where I've committed, is starting with mental health and drug addiction. I announced at the end of January that one of the first things I would do when I was premier of this province would be to redevelop the 244 acres of the Riverview lands in Coquitlam, where I live. And that was, as some of your viewers will know this, but not everyone, there's a 100-year history at Riverview of being a home for the mentally ill, people incapable of taking care of themselves. My view is not just to reopen it, because all those buildings are full of asbestos that you can't reopen those at all, but you can redevelop it into a world-class facility of research as well as housing for mental health, drug addiction recovery, and also brain injury, because my friends in the medical business tell me that there's a lot of crossover between people who need help on brain injury. A lot of the same treatments and concerns exist, so you can actually get a little better bang for your buck. This will cost billions of dollars, but you know what? Over about a 10-year period. But 2 things. Number 1, it'll also have housing for people who cannot take care of themselves. We need to step up to involuntary care and remove people from the streets and stop stepping over them. And you know what happens when you start to do that? The drug dealers stand out. Now you're into policing. And now you've got a premier, being me, who will give instructions to our Crown prosecutors to request from the courts incarceration, not bail, for people who are peddling poison to the people who are so vulnerable at that point in their lives. And then you move from there to the regulation burden we talked about 10 minutes ago, and you actually will start reviving your main streets. But one last thing, where's the money going to come from all this? We've got a bankrupt province that's had its 5th credit rating downgrade last week, which is millions of more dollars getting spent on interest and not on programs for the taxpayer. Here's where the money's going to come from. We are currently spending probably $2.5 billion a year on the downtown east side alone. When I left government, it was $3 million a day, which is $1 billion a year. A day. $3 million a day. It's now at least 6.5. So there's $2 billion a year that can be put directly into redoing and reapproaching or approaching in a different way how we treat with our mental health and drug addiction issues using facilities like where, and this will be my last comment for you. The best thing about Riverview is it exists in a community that has coexisted with people who are facing down mental health challenges for basically 140 odd years. There's no NIMBYism. And it's very difficult in this province for people to get comfortable with the notion that a major facility that treats people who are in a really desperate part in their lives is okay to have anywhere near them. The mayor of Coquitlam, by the way, his house literally backs onto the Riverview grounds. And it's a 5-foot chain link fence. It's not 10 feet tall with barbed wire. And that is probably the biggest thing it's got going for us. And that gives me hope. It gives me hope that we can actually bring to an end this cycle of travesty and heartbreak as we watch our brothers and sisters and parents and cousins get caught in that horrific cycle of drug addiction. So I'm glad you asked that question because it's not only central to my campaign, but I believe it reflects the value system not just of Conservatives to take care of each other who need it, but also all British Columbians.
Okay, that's an excellent answer and a tremendous conversation, Iain. I appreciate it very much. Just before we sign off, so how do people find out more information about you and your campaign, and where can they go to connect with you?
Well, it's a little joke. First of all, we always make the joke, vote early, vote often, right? But in order to vote, you got to be a member. And if you go to my website, www.iainblack.ca, you'll get a button there that says join. And I'd love your feedback. There's an opportunity to send emails. You've been terrific, David, and very generous in giving long form answers. It's really important to get them because these are big conversations. So thank you for your generous way of approaching these conversations. And to all the viewers, thanks for tuning in. I'd love your feedback. I love your support. If you're already members of the party, I'd be honored to earn your first vote in this contest. And if you've already committed to somebody else, getting your second vote would be wonderful. There's 3 of us who are vying for this. Statistically, it's pretty much a tie right now. And so this race belongs to anybody. The number 1 vote choice at the moment, by the way, is somebody named Undecided. And so there's lots of time left in this contest. It can go a bunch of different ways. I'm grateful to my maiden British Columbia team for getting us this far, and we're excited about the second half of the contest that lies ahead.
Okay, that's tremendous. Thank you so much again, Iain, for having this conversation with us today. My guest has been Iain Black, contender for the Conservative Party of BC leadership race, coming out fast. So my name is David Brett, editor of the New Westminster Times. Thanks very much again for watching.